The mountains of eastern Afghanistan do not forgive mistakes. They swallow whole teams, erase footprints, and turn sound into something cruel and deceptive. Wind moves through the passes like a living thing, shifting direction without warning, bending trajectories that any normal shooter would never dare attempt. The elevation changes everything. The cold bites into metal and turns breath into small clouds that can give away a position. The rocks are sharp and unforgiving underfoot. And somewhere in those gray and ancient ridge lines, on a morning when the sun had barely pulled itself above the peaks, a woman named Corporal Maya Vasquez lay completely still behind a Barrett M82A1. Her breathing slow and measured, her eye pressed against a Night Force scope. And she waited. She had been waiting for 11 hours. The rest of her team knew better than to ask her how she was doing. They had learned that a long time ago, back in training when she had once held a position for 16 hours without moving. Without eating, without making a sound. Just watching a target zone with that particular kind of patience that most people could not even understand, let alone imitate. Some of the men in her unit had tried to figure out what made her different. A few of them had theories. One sergeant said she simply did not feel discomfort the way normal people did. Another believed she had trained her mind to enter some kind of quiet space that blocked out everything except the mission. But the truth was simpler and more complicated at the same time. Maya Vasquez had grown up in the mountains of New Mexico, the daughter of a former Marine father and a mother who had worked as a wilderness guide. She had been shooting since she was 8 years old. She had been reading wind since she was 10. By the time she joined the Army at 18, she already knew things about long-range ballistics that most professional snipers spent years learning. The military had not created her skill. It had only sharpened it. She had joined as an intelligence specialist first, working in analysis, before pushing hard for combat roles when regulations shifted enough to allow women into direct action positions. She had fought for her place on the team with the kind of quiet, relentless determination that made arguing with her feel pointless. She did not brag. She did not push herself forward in conversations. She simply performed, and her performance record spoke in a language that nobody could argue with on this particular morning. In a valley whose name most Americans would never be able to pronounce. The mission was straightforward in its description, but terrifying in its execution. Intelligence had confirmed that a high-value target, a man responsible for coordinating supply chains for 3 separate insurgent networks operating across 2 provinces, was expected to move through a narrow pass between 2 ridgelines at some point during a 6-hour window. The window had opened 5 hours ago. The target had not yet appeared. This was not unusual. These people were careful. They moved in patterns that seemed random, but were actually built on years of survival instinct. They trusted local informants who sometimes gave them advance warning. They used multiple routes and changed them often. Getting a confirmed shot opportunity at this particular man had taken 7 months of intelligence work. 4 separate failed attempts, and 1 operation that had gone badly wrong and cost the team a good man. Maya knew all of this. She held it in her mind, not as pressure, but as information. Pressure was something you let into your body. Information was something you used. Commander Derek Walsh crouched in a shallow depression 30 meters behind her position, his body pressed against the cold rock, his radio set to receive only. He had been running special operations for 11 years. He had worked with some of the finest snipers in the world, men who had taken confirmed shots at distances that still got talked about in training schools. He had learned to trust the people on his team completely, or not at all, and his trust in Vasquez was absolute and slightly unsettling. Unsettling because it was the kind of trust you placed in someone whose abilities had moved beyond what you fully understood. He could manage everything about this operation except the final moment. That moment belonged entirely to her. The radio crackled once. Walsh listened. Intelligence was updating the movement window. The target had been spotted 12 kilometers north, moving on foot with a small escort of 3 men. Estimated arrival at the pass in approximately 45 minutes. Walsh relayed the information to Vasquez with 2 words in their code system. She acknowledged with a single click of her transmit button. She adjusted nothing. She was already set up for the shot. The calculations had been done, and were done before she had even settled into position the night before. Distance was the obvious challenge, but distance was almost the least of her concerns. At 3,247 meters, which was the distance from her current position to the center of the pass, the bullet would be in flight for more than 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, the world would do everything it could to push it off course. The wind at her position was reading one thing. The wind at mid-range was likely reading something different. The wind at the target zone was unknown and would have to be estimated based on the movement of vegetation and dust she could observe through the scope from this distance. The Earth's rotation would introduce a small but calculable drift. The temperature differential between the valley floor and the ridge line would affect bullet velocity. The altitude would affect air density in ways that required specific adjustment factors. All of this was already accounted for in the firing solution she had built, but a firing solution was a prediction, not a promise. The world did not always agree to behave the way predictions suggested. 40-5 minutes passed in near silence. Walsh watched the pass through his own optics, a pair of military-grade binoculars that could resolve detail at extreme ranges. He saw nothing. Then he saw movement. 4 figures, exactly as intelligence had described. They moved carefully, using the natural cover of the rock formations, stopping and scanning at intervals that showed training and awareness. The target was the third figure in the line, identifiable by the distinctive jacket that matched the description from the intelligence brief. Walsh did not say anything. He did not need to. Vasquez had been watching for several minutes already. Through her scope, at the maximum magnification her setup would allow, the figures were visible, small and clear, and real. She identified the target. She confirmed the escort positions. She tracked the movement, reading the pace, predicting where the group would be in 30 seconds, in 60, in 90. She was building a picture of their rhythm, looking for the moment when the target would be most exposed, when his movement would be most predictable, when the geometry of the pass would offer the cleanest line. Her breathing had slowed to something that barely seemed like breathing at all. Her heartbeat, which she had spent years learning to control through specific techniques, was dropping toward the optimal rate. The world outside the scope was ceasing to exist in any meaningful way. There was only the view through the glass, the data in her mind, the wind reading she was continuously updating, the crosshair, and the figure moving through that distant pass. Walsh, watching through his own glass, was aware of his own heartbeat in a way that he rarely was during operations. He was a calm man. He had been trained and had trained himself to be calm in situations that would break most people. But something about the scale of what was happening here, the sheer distance, the precision required, the stakes attached to this particular target, made his body want to be something other than calm. He controlled it. He watched. He waited. The target paused. It was a natural pause, the kind that comes when someone is tired or checking their surroundings. He stood slightly more upright than he had been walking, which gave a better profile against the rock behind him. He turned his head to speak to the man behind him, and Maya Vasquez fired. The sound of the shot was enormous in the mountain air, a crack that bounced off the valley walls and came back distorted and multiplied. Walsh felt it more than heard it, a physical thing that moved through his chest. He kept his glass on the target. 3 seconds is a long time when you're watching through binoculars at a target nearly 2 miles away, and a bullet is somewhere between you and them, and everything depends on calculations made by a human being lying on cold rock. The target dropped. Walsh went rigid. Not from shock. From something that was hard to describe, a kind of full-body recognition that something extraordinary had just happened. He had seen a lot of things in 11 years of operations. He had worked with people who were very good. What he had just witnessed was something that he did not have a category for. He turned and looked at Vasquez. She had not moved. She was still behind the scope, still watching, confirming the hit, checking the response of the escort, reading the situation with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything. She was doing her job. Walsh said nothing. He could not have said anything that would have meant what he needed it to mean. Around him, the rest of the small team was processing what had just happened. Nobody spoke. The radio began to crackle with communications about the developing situation at the target location, the escort scattering, the confirmation of the hit coming through from a separate observation post that had been positioned closer in. The debrief happened 12 hours later, in a forward operating base that smelled of diesel and cold concrete. Maya Vasquez sat at a plain metal table with a cup of coffee she had not yet touched, a notebook open in front of her, and the particular kind of stillness that she carried around in the hours after an operation. Walsh sat across from her. The intelligence officer, a young woman named Captain Torres, who had coordinated the 7-month effort that had led to this morning, sat at the end of the table with a laptop and a recording device. Two senior NCOs rounded out the room. The overhead light was harsh and threw no shadows. The confirmed details were being read aloud. The target was dead. The escort had scattered and been tracked by drone to a location that was already being processed for a follow-on operation. The intelligence value of the morning's success was still being calculated, but initial assessments were significant. The supply coordination function that the target had been running would be disrupted for weeks at minimum, possibly months, depending on how well his replacement network had been prepared to step in. Walsh listened to all of it and then said, "Let's talk about the shot." Torres looked up from her laptop. The NCOs looked at Walsh. Maya looked at her coffee. The confirmed range, Walsh said, was 3,247 meters. That's a new confirmed record for a combat engagement. By over 200 meters, he paused. "I want to make sure we document this correctly." Maya finally picked up her coffee. "The conditions helped," she said. "The wind was more stable than expected in the final 1,000 meters. The target held position longer than I anticipated. I had more time to refine the reading. The conditions," Walsh said, and there was something in his tone that suggested he found this particular response interesting, included a 4,000-meter elevation, a crosswind that was shifting at your position every 8 to 12 minutes, and a target that was partially obscured by a rock formation for the first 90 seconds of its stop. You had approximately a 40-second clean window. At 3+ kilometers, Maya nodded slowly. "That's accurate." Torres was looking at her now with an expression that mixed professional admiration with something that might have been personal wonder. Torres had spent years in intelligence work. She understood what the people in the field did, understood it intellectually, and through the reports she read and the briefings she attended. But there were moments when the reports became something else. When the numbers on the page became real in a way that made the numbers feel almost inadequate. The firing solution, Maya continued, was built on 17 data points. Some of them were estimated because I couldn't get direct readings at the target location from my position. The wind at range was extrapolated from vegetation movement and from what I could observe of dust patterns in the pass. There's always uncertainty in that kind of extrapolation. Today the uncertainty fell the right way. It wasn't luck, Walsh said. No, Maya agreed. It wasn't luck. But it wasn't certainty either. It's never certainty at that range. You build the best picture you can, and then you accept that the last part is probability, not guarantee. Today, the probability went the right way. On a different day, with the same preparation and the same skill, it might not. This was the thing about Vasquez that Walsh had noticed early. The thing that made working with her feel different from working with other exceptional operators. She was completely without ego about her abilities. Not false modesty, which is its own kind of ego, but a genuine and functional understanding that her skill was a tool and tools had limits, and knowing the limits was as important as knowing the capabilities. Some of the best snipers he had worked with over the years carried their reputation like a weight they needed to prove over and over. Vasquez carried hers like a piece of equipment, useful when needed, stored when not, maintained carefully. The debrief continued for another hour. Every aspect of the operation was reviewed. Torres had questions about the timeline, about the movement patterns of the escort, about the confirmation protocol for target identification. The NCOs had operational questions about communication timing and exit route decisions. Walsh had questions about everything, because asking questions was how he learned and how he ensured the team learned. Through all of it, Maya answered directly and completely and without decoration. She described decisions the way an engineer describes calculations, with precision and acknowledgement of variables and honest assessment of what had been known and what had been assumed when they were done. Torres closed her laptop and looked at Maya for a moment. Then she said, "Do you know what your confirmed career total is now?" The analysts were running numbers this afternoon. Maya looked at her. "I don't track that." 41 confirmed combat engagements, Torres said. 41 confirmed hits. 0 misses on confirmed engagements. That's across 3 deployments and to different theaters. The room was quiet. Maya said nothing. "The reason I mention it," Torres said, "is that the people upstairs are going to want to talk to you about training roles. They're going to want to pull you out of field rotation and put you in front of students. I've seen it happen with others at your level. I wanted you to hear it from someone who's been in the room when those conversations happen, so you're not caught off guard." Walsh watched Maya's face. He had known this conversation was coming eventually. He had known it from the first time he had watched her work, maybe 8 months ago on a rooftop in a different country, in different weather, with a different target. You could not have someone with her capabilities in the field indefinitely without the institution eventually deciding that her value as a teacher outweighed her value as an operator. It was a calculation the military made regularly. It was not always the wrong calculation. "I'm aware that's a possibility," Maya said. She said it in a tone that made clear she had thought about it and had not yet decided how she felt about it. Torres nodded. "Just wanted you to know." Walsh walked Maya out after the debrief, into a courtyard where the night was cold and very clear, and the stars were visible in enormous numbers, the way they are at high altitude far from city lights. They stood without speaking for a moment. "You doing all right?" Walsh asked. Maya looked up at the stars. "Yes, that's a long time to be in a position. I've been in longer." Walsh was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The new guy, Specialist Renfro. He asked me in the field who you were aiming at." After the shot, Maya looked at him. "I told him the right person," Walsh said. "Always the right person." Maya was quiet for a moment. "That's a good answer," she said. "He came and found me later," Walsh continued. "He wanted to know more about you. Your background, how you developed the skill, how long you've been doing this. He's young. He's good, but he's young. He's at the stage where he's figuring out who to be, if you know what I mean." Maya knew exactly what he meant. She had been at that stage once herself, watching the people around her who were extraordinary at what they did and trying to understand not just the technique, but the character behind the technique. The best teacher she had ever had was a retired sergeant major named Patterson, who had spent 3 days doing nothing with her but sitting at different distances and talking about wind. Not how to read it. Just about wind itself, its nature, its behavior, its relationship with geography and temperature. He had not taught her to shoot. He had taught her to think about the entire system she was a part of when she shot. "Tell him to come talk to me," Maya said. Walsh raised an eyebrow. He had not expected that. Maya did not generally invite conversations about herself or her work. She was not unfriendly, but she tended to let her performance speak for itself and to avoid anything that felt like it was sliding toward mythology. "Tell him to come talk to me," she repeated. "Not about the shot. About preparation. About what the 11 hours before the shot looked like. About what it means to do the boring part with the same attention you give the moment. Because the moment is nothing without everything that came before it." Walsh looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. "I'll tell him." Maya looked up at the stars again. Somewhere a long way away, the effects of this morning's work were still unfolding. Reports were being written. Networks were reassessing. Operations that had depended on the target's coordination were pausing or shifting. The supply lines would adjust eventually, find new paths, new people. The work was never finished. There was always another problem, developing somewhere in the complicated, messy, ancient landscape of human conflict. That was not a reason to stop doing the work well. It was just the nature of the work. She thought about the question that had been hanging in the air since Torres had mentioned it. The training role. The idea of stepping back from the field and standing in front of students in a classroom or on a range and trying to transfer what she knew into other people. She was not certain that what she knew could be transferred that way, in the structured and institutional manner that military training tended to favor. What she had was not a technique. It was a way of existing in relation to a problem, a way of treating complexity with patience and treating patience as an active state rather than a passive one.